He paid her to clean his cabin, but when he followed her home, he found her living with 5 kids. She was just the woman he paid to clean his cabin, quiet, distant, gone before the sun rose. But one night when she didn't return, he followed her home. What he found? A collapsing shack in the woods, 5 children sharing one blanket, and a mother holding the world together with silence. This isn't just a story of survival, it's a revelation of who she really was, of what she'd escaped, and of how one man, broken in his own quiet way, learned that sometimes the smallest acts of noticing can save lives. As you follow this journey, ask yourself, what would you have done if you'd been him or her? Because sometimes the people we pass by carry whole worlds behind their silence. Comment below with the moment that moved you most. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to. In a corner of the world where dust clung to everything and the wind didn't ask for permission, life moved slow. People kept to themselves. Doors weren't locked because no one ever came calling, not unless they had a reason. Eli had long stopped expecting visitors. He wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not forgiveness, not redemption. Just the stillness of the woods, the creak of old floorboards, and the cold coffee he left half drunk each morning. But then she came. She didn't knock, didn't speak, just stood at the edge of his porch with a ragged coat, a tired gaze, and eyes that refused to ask for help. He hired her because the cabin needed cleaning, not because he needed company. But over time, the silence she brought began to fill the space more completely than any conversation ever had. She swept floors without humming, cooked without clatter, left before the sun touched the ridge. And still, he noticed. The way she moved, the way her hands folded into themselves when she thought no one was looking, the way the children followed behind her like shadows, unannounced, uncounted, but always there. He never asked her name. She never gave it. But each time she left, he watched, not out of suspicion, but because something in him, something long asleep, began to stir. It wasn't her voice that reached him, it was her silence. A silence that carried weight, history, and somehow an invitation to listen, to witness, to begin again. And maybe he hadn't meant to follow her, but something about the way she disappeared each afternoon, like mist dissolving into the pines, pulled at him. Eli wasn't the kind of man who concerned himself with other people's lives. In fact, he'd built his cabin far enough from town for that very reason. But she was different. She didn't talk much, if at all. She came to clean, hands quick and eyes steady, then vanished before the kettle had even cooled. That morning the rain had just stopped when he noticed her footprints veering off the road, small, deliberate, almost like she was trying not to be followed. Still, something about them made him pause, then move. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe, somewhere deep in the part of him that still believed people mattered, he just needed to know where she went when no one was looking. The trail twisted through the woods like a forgotten thread. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the birds seemed to be holding their breath. And then, almost hidden beneath the underbrush and trees bent low by time, he saw it. A shack, not a home, not even a shelter by most standards. Just a skeletal frame of wood and tin, patched together with plastic sheets, bits of tarp, and what looked like an old curtain. A clothesline sagged between two trees. Tiny shirts, worn thin by time and weather, danced in the breeze. He stopped cold. A small figure stepped out from behind the tarp, barefoot, maybe 6 years old, holding a stick like it might be a sword. Behind him, another child crouched over a campfire, carefully tending to a dented pot. More faces appeared, none older than 10, all with the same watchful eyes. There were 5 of them, 5 children, alone but not afraid. And then she appeared, the woman from the cabin. She didn't flinch at his presence. She didn't speak. Just knelt beside a little girl, adjusting a too big sweater on the child's shoulders, then resumed slicing potatoes with the calm of someone who'd done this every day for years, with or without help. Eli felt the breath leave him. Not from shock, not exactly, but from the weight of it all, the silence, the structure barely holding itself together, the fact that she'd never asked for more than what he'd given, never asked for anything at all. She didn't explain. He didn't ask. Something in her stillness made him feel like a trespasser, not on her land but on her dignity. This was her world, fragile and hidden, stitched together by resilience and necessity. And though he towered over her in size and circumstance, he suddenly felt impossibly small. It was the girl's eyes that got him, the one leaning against her mother's leg, wide, dark, and unblinking. She looked at him not with fear but with a question he couldn't answer. Not yet. He turned to leave, slower than he'd come. Not because there was nothing left to see, but because everything he'd just witnessed was too much to carry all at once. That night he couldn't sleep. The image of the shack, the fire, those tiny, unflinching eyes, they stayed with him. And he realized, some people survive not by fighting but by refusing to fall apart. The next morning, Eli left a loaf of bread by the trail. It wasn't much, just something he'd baked the night before, hands restless and heart heavier than usual. He wrapped it in cloth and tucked it under a stone near the edge of the woods. No note, no expectation, just bread warm enough to still carry the scent of rosemary when he placed it down. He didn't look back as he walked away. That kind of thing, it wasn't about being seen. By late afternoon it was gone. The following day in its place sat a small woven basket. Inside, 6 eggs, a few still speckled with dirt, and a folded scrap of paper. The handwriting was careful, almost hesitant. Just one word, "Thank you." He stared at it for a long time. The eggs weren't payment. They were something else. A gesture. A reply. Like the pause between 2 verses of a song only a few people knew the tune to. Later that week, the oldest of the children appeared near the edge of Eli's property. He didn't come close, just stood there holding the same basket. This time filled with wild berries, slightly crushed, like they'd been carried too far in too small hands. The boy said nothing, just looked at Eli with a steady kind of gaze, one that belonged to someone far older than his years. Then, without a word, he placed the basket down and turned back toward the woods. Eli stood there long after the boy had disappeared. That look, it wasn't a thank you. It wasn't fear. It was something simpler, a quiet offering of trust. He started leaving small things by the tree near the path. A tin of honey, a pair of wool socks, a bar of soap wrapped in cloth. Nothing grand, nothing loud. And each time they were taken, sometimes replaced, sometimes not, but always acknowledged. There were no conversations, no names exchanged. Just this rhythm, give, receive, return. It was a kind of dance, slow and careful, between two lives orbiting each other without collision. Eli didn't know when it changed. When he stopped seeing himself as a man helping strangers and started thinking about them as people, real and rooted, no longer fading at the edge of his world. Maybe it was the way the girl started waving, or the way the youngest began leaving small rocks stacked on the path, like cairns guiding a hiker home. What he did know was this: connection doesn't always begin with conversation. Sometimes it starts with bread left on a stone and grows in the space between what's said and what's quietly done. Sometimes trust is built not through promise. The storm came hard and uninvited, sheets of rain slicing sideways through the valley, tearing branches, swallowing paths. Eli had seen many storms, had waited them out by his fire, listening to wood groan and wind sing through the cracks in the walls. But this one felt different. It wasn't the lightning or the roar that unsettled him, it was the absence. Myra didn't come. She always showed up, even in drizzle, even when her eyes told stories she wouldn't speak aloud. Every afternoon, like clockwork, she'd arrive at the edge of the clearing, silent but reliable. Until now. The hours passed slowly, the storm louder than usual in his chest. By the time dusk bled into the trees, the worry that had been pacing at the edges of his mind became a sharp and sudden force. He threw on his coat, grabbed the lantern, and left. The path to the woods was muddier than usual, the earth pulling at his boots like it wanted him to stop. But he didn't. He moved fast, ducking under limbs, ignoring the sting of rain against his face. At some point the lantern sputtered out and he relied on memory, instinct, and something else, something quieter, more primal. A pull. He found her near a bend in the trail where the slope dipped just enough to gather water and pain. She was collapsed in the mud, half covered by the edge of her own coat, one hand cradling her belly, the other bloodied and open like she'd tried to crawl. Eli dropped to his knees. The sight of her hit him like a fist to the ribs. Her skin was cold, too cold and pale, her breath shallow. There was blood, not too much but enough to make his heart lurch. He whispered her name once, twice. No answer. Then her lips moved. "Don't let my baby die." Just that. No plea for herself. No scream. Just 5 words, barely audible over the storm's retreat. He lifted her gently, arms trembling, and began the walk back. It was longer than he remembered. Each step felt heavier, not because of her weight, but because of the question pressing against his ribs. Was he too late? At the cabin, he stoked the fire like a man possessed, wrapped her in blankets, boiled water, cleaned her wounds with hands that had built fences and carved timber, but had never touched a woman this fragile, this fierce. The children didn't come. He guessed they were still huddled in the shack, waiting for a mother who hadn't made it home. All night he sat beside her, feeding her sips of water, dabbing her forehead, whispering words he wasn't sure she could hear. She stirred once, opened her eyes just enough to see him, then slipped back into sleep or something quieter. In those hours, something shifted in him. She hadn't asked for rescue. She hadn't planned for anyone to find her. She'd been on her way back to them, those 5 children and the one she still carried. She de-risked the storm, her body, everything, not for herself, but for the child not yet born. Eli had known many kinds of strength. The kind men wore on their sleeves, shouted about in bars, proved in fights. But this silent, determined, bleeding woman in the mud kind of strength, he'd never seen anything like it. And in that quiet firelight, with her breathing shallow but steady, he made a promise. Not aloud, not. They arrived in silence. Eli carried her while the children followed close behind, like shadows learning to trust the sun again. No one spoke. No one cried. Even the smallest boy, with bare feet and a scraped knee, didn't utter a word. Just clutched his sister's hand and kept moving. The cabin door creaked open to welcome them, not as guests, but as something softer, more uncertain. Refugees of a kind. Eli laid Myra gently on the cot beside the hearth, her breath faint but more rhythmic now. He wrapped her in quilts and stoked the fire, letting the warmth speak for him. He didn't ask the children anything, didn't quiz them on names or ages. Instead, he brought out bread, cheese, a jar of pickled carrots he'd canned last spring. They sat around the kitchen table, silent at first, chewing slowly, eyes darting between him and the walls, as if waiting for someone to scold them just for being there. But no one did. Later, he showed them the loft where they could sleep. It wasn't much, just straw mattresses and a few wool blankets. But when the girl named Clara laid down beside her brothers, she giggled. A high, surprised kind of sound, like it had slipped out before she could stop it. Then Ben, the middle boy, let out a snort. Nathan tried to stay serious, but the laughter caught in his chest and broke out like a hiccup. It echoed across the beams, soft and awkward and honest. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong in a courtroom or a cold shack. It belonged here. In that moment, Eli realized he hadn't heard real laughter in months, maybe years. Certainly not this kind. Not the laughter of children who had survived more than they could explain, who hadn't laughed because they didn't think they were allowed to. Downstairs, the fire cracked gently. Myra stirred, her face turned toward the ceiling. Her eyes fluttered open. She didn't speak, just looked around, chest rising slowly, one hand moving to her side as if confirming that she was still whole. Then her gaze found his Eli's and stayed there. There was no smile, no question, just a look, long and quiet and real, like someone taking inventory of a space she hadn't dared imagine could be hers. He nodded once. Not as a welcome, but as something firmer. "You're safe here." She didn't nod back, but her eyes softened. That night, Eli didn't sleep much. He stayed near the fire, listening to the rise and fall of small breaths from the loft, the occasional murmur of a dream or a blanket shifting. These were not his children. This was not his family. And yet the silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was whole. For the first time in a long time, the cabin didn't feel empty, not because of noise, but because of presence. Because sometimes, peace doesn't arrive with declarations or fanfare. It settles in slowly, in the quiet laughter of children who no longer sleep with shoes on, just in case they have to run. It begins when someone finally closes their eyes and doesn't flinch. It began with a knock that didn't sound like a stranger's. 3 slow taps, too calm for panic, too measured for welcome. The kind of knock that expects the door to open, not hopes it will. Eli wiped his hands on a cloth, glanced at the children curled up near the fire, then opened the door. 2 men stood there. One, clean-cut, coat buttoned to the chin, hair parted sharp enough to slice. The other, older, wiry, with a face like winter bark and a briefcase that looked like it hadn't touched dirt in its life. "We're looking for Myra Jansen," the first said. "I'm her husband. These are my children." His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It was full of paperwork and verdicts, the kind that doesn't ask, it declares. Behind Eli, Myra appeared without a sound. Just her presence shifted the air in the room. Her shoulders were square, but her arms crossed tight around her waist like she was holding something in. The man, Roland, smiled. "There you are," he said, like he was greeting a dog that had wandered home. "You've been hard to find." Myra didn't move. Eli's eyes went to her hands, how they gripped the shawl tighter, fingers brushing her collarbone. Then he saw it. Not the scar itself, but the way she flinched when the wind lifted the edge of her scarf. A memory lived there beneath the fabric, something thin and long pressed into her skin like a forgotten word. Roland stepped forward. "I've filed for full custody. I'm here to take the children back where they belong." Still, she didn't speak. Just looked at him the way someone might look at a fire from far away, not afraid of the flame, but of the burn that still lingered. The lawyer opened his case, unfolded a stack of papers. "The court has granted Mr. Jansen a preliminary order. Unless she can prove abuse, which there is no formal record of, we're within rights to request emergency custody." Myra blinked once, then again. Her mouth opened but no words came. Not because she didn't have them, but because she knew the sound of her voice had once meant nothing. She had screamed before, cried, pleaded. All that had earned her was silence and bruises, buried under nice suits and legal phrases like unstable, unfit, hysterical. Eli didn't touch her. He didn't have to. "She didn't run," he said. His voice, like the storm the week before, rolled low. "She escaped." Roland scoffed. "You have no idea what she's done, what she is." "I know what she's survived." The children were quiet behind them, ears perked from the corner of the room, eyes darting between the adults. They weren't afraid of Roland. Not anymore. What they feared was being told they had to go back. That the hiding, the running, the sleeping with shoes on would begin again. Eli stepped aside just slightly, not to invite them in, but to make room for her to choose. And she did. Myra moved forward just one step and raised her chin. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled the scarf from her neck. The scar was thin, pale, but deep. The room froze. She didn't explain it, didn't need to. The mark told its own story. A story Roland's smile couldn't erase and his lawyer couldn't refute. Then she did speak. "I'm not going back," she said, voice low, steady. "Not with you, not ever." Roland's face twisted. "You don't have a choice." But she did. Because now she wasn't alone. Eli didn't speak again. He simply stepped closer, not in front of her, but beside. Silent, steady. And in that moment it was clear. Roland could bring all the papers in the world. But he couldn't undo what had already begun. A home. A name reclaimed. A strength that The form was simple: white paper, a few black boxes, and a line that read, "Requested name change." To anyone else it might have looked like paperwork, another task in the quiet rebuilding of life. But to Myra it was something more. It was the undoing of a chain. She sat at the table with the form in front of her, morning light slanting through the cabin window, pooling over her shoulders. The children were outside with Eli, gathering kindling. Laughter drifted through the cracks in the wood, faint but real. It had taken months for that sound to return, even longer for her to believe it wasn't a dream. She stared at the name on the first line, Myra Jansen. It was neat, impersonal, a remnant of a past that had once swallowed her whole. That name had been spoken in courtrooms, hissed in arguments, stitched into bruises and threats. It had been carved onto envelopes filled with lies and apologies that never came. Every time she'd heard it, she'd flinched, not because of the name itself, but because of who had owned it. And now she was letting it go. Not because someone offered her a new one, but because, for the first time in years, she realized she didn't need permission to be someone else. She picked up the pen, its weight steadier than her hands, not from nerves, but from reverence. She didn't choose her maiden name. That life, too, had its shadows. And she didn't take Eli's name, not because she didn't care for him, but because this name wasn't about love, at least not romantic love. It was about something older, deeper. She chose Cooper. It was the name of Eli's mother, a woman she'd never met but who had built this cabin with her hands and left behind the quilt Myra now slept under. It was the name stitched into the pages of books the children read at night. The name that hung quietly in the corners of this home, not as ownership, but as legacy. When she handed the form to the town clerk 2 days later, the woman blinked. "You want to change your name to Cooper?" Myra nodded. "No hyphen, no middle name." "No," she said, "just Cooper." The woman tilted her head. "He your husband?" "No." Myra's voice was soft but unshaken. "He's the one who didn't ask me to stay. Just made sure I knew I could." There was a silence then, brief but respectful. By the time she left the office, the wind had picked up. It tangled her hair as she stepped out into the sun, but she didn't lift a hand to tame it. She let it move around her, through her. Like it knew, she wasn't walking with someone else's name anymore. She was walking forward with her own. Later that evening, she returned to the cabin. Eli was tending to the chickens. The kids were playing near the creek, Lisa trying to teach Clara how to skip stones. Myra stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching. Eli looked up. He didn't say anything, just gave a small nod, one that didn't demand explanation, one that understood. She stepped forward, held out the form. "I changed my name," she said simply. He took it. "Read it." And then looked up, not with surprise, but with something softer. "That's a good name," he said. "I thought so too." That night, when she tucked the kids in and turned out the lamp, Myra Cooper sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket not given but chosen. And in the glow of the coals, with no one to claim her but herself, she smiled. Because freedom wasn't about running anymore. It was about naming herself in the quiet and being heard. Some nights sleep didn't come easily. Not even in the quiet of the valley, where the wind moved gently through the trees and the world on the surface seemed at rest. For Myra, the dark had never been restful. Darkness was when things were taken, when doors were kicked open, when footsteps grew louder down hallways, when her breath would catch before a scream that never helped. Night was a place she learned to hold her children tighter, to stay half awake and half afraid. But here in Eli's cabin, night began to change shape. It wasn't immediate. The fear didn't vanish because she crossed a threshold. The body remembers what the heart tries to forget. What did change, what began to shift her, was the lamp. It stood near the stove, tall and quiet, casting a warm circle of light across the stone floor. And each night, without fail, long after the children were asleep and Eli had retreated to the far end of the house, the lamp stayed lit. At first she thought it was an accident. Maybe he was careless. Maybe he forgot to snuff it out. But the pattern was too precise. On the nights she woke, heart racing, breath shallow, hand gripping the edge of the blanket, she'd turn her head and there it was. A glow, not bright enough to demand attention, but steady, constant, unmoving. She began watching for it, waiting. Even when she didn't wake in fear, her eyes would flicker toward it in the early hours. And without fail, the lamp stood, its flame unwavering. One night she walked quietly to the kitchen. Rain had begun to fall, a soft whisper across the roof. She found him there, seated at the table, carving a piece of wood into something shapeless. The room smelled faintly of cedar and burnt coffee. He didn't look up, just kept working like her presence was expected, like this had happened before and would happen again. "You leave it on," she said. "Huh." "The lamp." He paused for a moment, then set the carving down. "It's easier to find your way to the kitchen if you don't have to think about where the floor creaks." She smiled faintly. "Is that why?" He met her eyes then, not with intensity but with a stillness that held weight. "No," he said, "not really." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. From then on, the lamp wasn't just a source of light. It became a signal. A message written in flame. "You're not alone here," it said. "I don't need to own you to stay," it said. "You don't owe me safety for me to offer it," it said. "If tonight feels hard, there's a glow waiting in the next room, a place to exhale." Eli never asked her to speak about the past, never touched her unless she reached first. But every night, without fail, he lit the lamp. And every morning, before the children stirred, Myra would rise and quietly blow it out. Not because she needed the dark again, but because now she knew the light was hers to choose. In a world that had once told her to fear silence, Eli gave her a new kind of quiet, one that didn't echo with threat, but offered space. And sometimes, love doesn't. It happened on an ordinary morning, the kind where the sun took its time spilling through the trees, and the cabin smelled of warm bread and pine smoke. Eli was by the stove, stirring a pot of porridge, while the children sat at the table, sleepy-eyed and wrapped in blankets. Myra was braiding Lisa's hair, soft and slow, her hands moving like she'd done it 100 times before, though this was maybe only the 7th. Clara had wandered in last. She was always the quietest, the one who spoke more with glances than words. Her tiny boots were muddy, one sock slipping low, and her hair stuck out in soft wisps from sleep. She climbed into the wooden chair nearest the fire and reached for a spoon. Eli turned, ladle in hand. "Morning, kiddo." She looked up, eyes round, calm, like she'd been waiting for the right moment, and then with no ceremony she said it. "Papa." The word barely filled the room. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't uncertain. It was small and sure and true, like it had been growing quietly in her chest and finally slipped out because she couldn't hold it in anymore. The room stilled. Lisa froze mid-braid. Ben's spoon paused mid-air. Myra's hands clenched slightly, then released. Eli stood perfectly still. He didn't smile. He didn't answer right away. He turned slowly back toward the stove, placed the ladle down, and pressed his hand against the edge of the counter. Clara didn't notice. She had already begun scooping her porridge, humming softly like nothing had changed. But everything had. Myra watched Eli's shoulders tighten, then shake, once, just once. Not like a man broken, but like someone trying very hard not to break. He wiped his face on the sleeve of his shirt before returning to the table, setting a bowl gently in front of her. "You eat up, little one," he said, voice low, steady. He didn't correct her, didn't tell her "I'm not your father," didn't look at Myra for permission, because he understood what that moment meant. It wasn't about names or titles or what made someone kin by law. It wasn't about the blood in your veins. It was about the space you created in your home, in your arms, in your silence. Clara had chosen her word, not because someone told her to, not because she needed to fill a void, but because, in her small, battered world, she had found one place that didn't make her afraid. And when a child, broken by too much leaving and not enough staying, calls someone Papa, it's not an accident. It's a declaration, a quiet, holy kind of trust. The courtroom wasn't grand. Just an old brick building in the middle of Millridge, with tired chairs and windows that let in too much light. It smelled of dust and coffee, and carried the weight of too many stories that had ended without justice. Myra sat at the front, hands folded in her lap. She wore a plain dress, the same one she'd worn the day Clara was born, and shoes that didn't quite match. Beside her, Eli sat silent, a pillar, not speaking for her but being with her. Across the aisle, Roland sat straighter, clean-shaven, polished boots, a jacket that smelled of money. His lawyer shuffled papers with fingers that had never held a child through fever. The judge adjusted his glasses, his tone weary before the proceedings even began. "Mr. Jansen, you're petitioning for the return of your children. On what grounds?" Roland stood. "My wife fled with them," he said, voice firm. "She left our home, our life, without permission, without cause. I'm here to bring them back." He called it home. Not the prison of silence, not the room with locked doors and cold dinners untouched. Just home. His lawyer added weight with paperwork, birth certificates, bank statements, a copy of a report labeling Myra as unstable from years ago. Eli clenched his jaw. Then it was Myra's turn. She didn't stand right away. When she did, she moved slow, like her legs were remembering how to carry weight not just of her body, but of truth. "I didn't flee," she said softly. "I walked out with my children the day he raised his hand a second time." The room stilled. "I was sold," she continued, voice quiet but firm, by my father to him when I was 17. No ceremony, just a debt to pay. I cooked, cleaned, gave birth to 5 babies, and never once did I get to sign a single paper that made me feel like a person. Roland shifted in his seat. His lawyer whispered, but the judge raised a hand. Let her speak. I stayed because I thought maybe that was what women did. I stayed when I was bruised, when my son flinched every time a door closed. I stayed when Clara cried through the night and he didn't wake. Her hands trembled. I left the night he called Lisa a mistake, not because I was brave, but because I knew if I didn't go then, none of us would survive what came next. She didn't cry, she didn't raise her voice. She just looked around the room, at the clerk, the bailiff, the judge, and maybe most of all at the strangers in the back row, the ones who hadn't looked at her when she entered but now couldn't look away. Eli's breath stayed low in his chest, steady only because he had to be. The judge rubbed his temples. There's no documented history of abuse, he said. No filed charges, no protective orders. Myra nodded once. Because when you're not allowed to sign your own name on a lease, who do you report it to? There was no ruling that day. No gavels slammed. Just papers shuffled, proceedings delayed. But as they stood to leave, something shifted in the room. The lawyer's voice lost its edge. The judge glanced at Myra, not as a defendant, but as a woman who had held more than most could bear. Roland walked out first, lips tight, hands empty. And Eli held the door for Myra, not because she needed help, but because she was finally walking out on her own terms. Justice didn't arrive with a stamp or a verdict that afternoon, but it echoed quietly in the hallway, in the nods from strangers, in the eyes that no longer turned away. Because sometimes, the most powerful moment in the cabin was too quiet. No laughter floated in from the trees, no footsteps thundered across the porch. The dishes remained untouched, and the air smelled of something worse than fear, absence. Myra stood in the middle of the room, her hands stiff at her sides, her breath caught somewhere between now and the last time she heard Clara's giggle. Lisa's coat was missing. Ben's favorite shoes gone. Even Scout, the dog, was nowhere to be found. It wasn't a mistake, not a wandering off. This was a message. Roland had come and gone like a shadow. No forced entry, no broken window, just 5 children missing. Taken before the court had the chance to speak again. While the law debated paperwork and timelines, he had acted. She didn't scream, didn't fall to her knees. She went to the shelf above the door, reached up and pulled down the old rifle. The one that hadn't seen daylight since Eli first patched the cabin roof. She opened the chamber with the ease of someone who'd once been taught how to survive, not how to live. Eli didn't speak. He had been outside, gathering wood. He stepped in, took one look at her face, then at the open space where the children's boots should be, and nodded once. He saddled the horse in silence. Because what do you say when someone takes your children? What words can hold the weight of 5 empty chairs, 5 scattered drawings on the wall, 5 beds still warm from the night before? They rode until dusk. The trail was messy, but it was there. Broken branches, a forgotten ribbon, the faint outline of a small hand in the river mud. Myra tracked them like an animal might. Head down, shoulders forward, eyes that didn't blink. Not vengeance, not rage, something older than that, something primal. When they reached the edge of a clearing just beyond the old trading post, they spotted them. Roland, two men beside him, and the children corralled near a wagon. Lisa saw her first. She didn't call out, just looked. And that look broke something. Not in Myra, in Eli. Because he'd seen soldiers break under fire, but nothing compared to the hollow eyes of a girl who'd been taken once too many. Myra stepped forward, rifle ready, her voice steady. Let them go. Roland turned, arms out. You have no right to be here. She didn't respond, not with words. She moved closer, each step measured, deliberate. I'm their mother. He scoffed. That's biology, doesn't make you fit. Eli stepped up beside her then, not to fight, not to speak, but to stand. Like the night at the stove, like the light he left on, but this time with fire in his hands. A standoff not of guns but of souls. And Roland, for all his power, backed away first. Not because of the rifle, but because of the woman behind it, the quiet mother who didn't beg, didn't plead, just stood. Because motherhood, real motherhood, isn't made in the hospital. It's made in moments like this, when you're willing to walk through fire, through the echo of every past bruise, just to bring your children home. And when the children ran to her, when Clara buried, the sky pressed low that morning, gray, tense, holding its breath like the earth knew what was about to happen. They had tracked Roland to an abandoned farmstead miles past the ridge. The house had collapsed long ago, but the barn stood, crooked but intact. Quiet, too quiet. Eli dismounted without a word, eyes sweeping the field. Myra followed, boots sinking into the damp soil. The rifle in her hand wasn't heavy anymore, it was familiar, like a piece of her past finally making sense. There were no screams, no cries for help, just silence. That's what terrified her most. Eli touched her arm. I'll draw him out. She didn't answer, just nodded once. Then he disappeared around the side of the barn. Myra moved quickly. Through the back, past weeds grown tall and brittle. Her breath came shallow but sure. Her heart wasn't racing, it was counting. Every step closer to her children. Inside the barn, dust hung thick in the air. Tools rusted where they'd been abandoned years before. And behind a stack of hay bales she saw it. A makeshift cage, chicken wire, wooden slats, a padlock. And inside, huddled together like wild animals, her children. Ben's hand clutched Clara's shoulder. Nathan stood in front like a shield. Lisa stared straight ahead, her eyes blank. Tommy whispered something, then stopped. They didn't cry. They didn't move, because fear had taught them that stillness meant safety. Myra swallowed hard. She dropped to her knees, hands moving fast, working at the wire, the hinges, anything. The padlock wouldn't budge. Then a noise. A voice, Roland's, shouting Eli's name. The sound of boots running, something crashing. Myra's fingers found the rifle's barrel. She turned. Roland stood at the entrance, alone, panting, furious. He raised his hand, not a weapon, just his palm. Like he still believed that gesture held power. Give them back. Her voice didn't waver. They were never yours. He stepped forward. She raised the rifle and fired. The shot echoed like thunder inside the barn. Dust exploded from the post beside his head. He stumbled back, not hit but shaken, shocked. Myra stepped between him and the cage. "You won't touch them again," she said. "Not now, not ever." Roland didn't speak. He didn't run. He just looked at her, this woman who had once begged, once stayed silent, and saw something he no longer understood. Not fear, not fury, conviction. Eli appeared in the doorway a moment later, bruised but standing. He didn't speak. Just moved to Roland, held him steady, and led him out like a man who'd already lost. And when Myra turned back to the cage, the children didn't flinch. Clara reached for her first, then Ben. Lisa buried her face in Myra's side. Tommy clung to her leg. And Nathan, stoic, proud Nathan, wrapped his arms around her waist and whispered, "You found us." But she shook her head. "No," she said, holding them close. "You were never lost." The barn, once a place of confinement, became something else that day. A place of return. A place where fear ended, not with blood, but with resolve. Because power isn't always in the shot fired. It's in the reason you pull the trigger. And Myra pulled it not to destroy, but to protect. To draw a line no one would ever cross again. And to tell her children. The sun rose differently now, not with the dread of another day survived, but with the promise of one more day lived, fully, freely, and together. There was no ceremony when they began rebuilding the cabin. Just hands, small and large, carrying wood, stacking stone, wiping sweat with sleeves and laughter. The old house still stood, weathered and loyal, but they needed something new. Not because the past didn't matter, but because it did. This time they would build a home not out of fear, but out of choice. Eli laid the first beam, steady and straight. Myra handed him the nails. Lisa painted the window frames yellow just because it felt like sunlight. Nathan insisted the porch be wide enough for everyone to sit on it at once. Clara picked wildflowers and tucked them between the rafters. And Ben, quiet but watchful, made sure the door didn't squeak, said a house should welcome you, not warn you. Each day passed not as a task to complete, but as a chapter written. In flour-dusted aprons, in scraped knees, in stories shared over soup and fire. Myra taught the children how to boil beans without burning them, how to mend a shirt, how to read a map, not to run, but to explore. She showed them how to leave the door unlocked when it was safe, and how to close it gently when the world outside got too loud. Eli never said much, but his presence filled the space like warmth from the hearth. He'd whistle while chopping wood, hum while fixing hinges, murmur bedtime tales of coyotes and stars. Myra would catch him sometimes, standing by the window looking out, not because he expected trouble, but because he still marveled that peace had stayed. One evening, when the roof was finished and the last board sanded smooth, Eli returned from town with a hand-carved sign tucked under his arm. He waited until the children were playing by the creek and Myra was kneading dough by the fire. He nailed the sign to the front beam. No announcement, just action. Myra stepped outside, wiping her hands. She read it once quietly. Cooper home. No first names. No declarations, just that. A name not inherited, not given, not forced. A name chosen. She turned to him and he looked unsure for the first time in weeks. "I thought it might be right," he said softly, "but I can take it down." Myra stared at it again, and something inside her settled, like a breath finally exhaled after years of holding it in. "You don't have to," she said. "It already is." That night they didn't say grace out loud, but every bite of stew, every shared glance, every child tucked in with their forehead kissed, it all felt like prayer. They didn't talk about the past much anymore, not because it didn't matter, but because it had already done enough. The scars didn't fade, but they stopped aching. The fear didn't vanish, but it lost its grip. And in that cabin, laughter echoed between walls they built with their own hands, not walls to keep danger out, but to hold one another in. It wasn't perfect, it was better, because home isn't a place you run to, it's the place you stop running. And for the first time, Myra didn't have to remind herself to breathe. She just did, inside a home she helped build, under a name she chose, beside people who didn't rescue her, just stayed. And that made all the difference. Healing doesn't arrive with thunder or applause. It walks in slowly, barefoot, through a door left unlocked, not to make a grand entrance, but because it finally knows it's welcome. Myra stood at the edge of the porch, watching the children chase fireflies beneath a sky that no longer felt like it was pressing down on her. Her hands no longer trembled. Her shoulders no longer curled inward. She had unlearned the flinch, the hush, the habit of scanning exits. She didn't need to run anymore. The past still lingered in the quiet, in the scars, but it no longer steered her. What defined her now was not what she had survived, but what she had chosen to stay, to love, to live out loud even in the softest ways. She was no longer just Myra Jansen, the girl who was sold, the woman who fled. She was Myra Cooper, a name born not of blood but of belief, a name that came after fire, after silence, after nights spent watching over 5 sleeping children and wondering if she was enough. Now she knew she was. Because one day she had turned around instead of running and found someone still there. Not to fix her, not to save her, but to stay. And in that staying something else bloomed, a quiet resurrection. The kind that grows not from rescue but from recognition. She taught her children that safety is not silence, that strength isn't loud, and that no one, no matter how broken, was born to run forever. And as the last of the fireflies disappeared into the dusk, Myra smiled, not because the story was perfect, but because it was hers, and that was enough. Some stories don't end with victory, they end with becoming whole. Myra didn't fight for revenge. She fought for her children's safety, for the right to choose her own name, and for the quiet freedom to tuck her kids into bed without fear. Eli didn't rescue her. He stayed, listened, and built something with her that no court could ever define, a home. In the end, it wasn't the cabin that changed, it was the people inside it. A woman who no longer ran, a man who finally stood still, and 5 children who learned what love looked like, not loud but lasting. Which moment in this story struck you the hardest? What lesson will stay with you after today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one. And if these stories speak to your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to Heart-Stirring Tales. When the fire dies down and the cabin grows quiet, what kind of light would you leave on for someone